morning. I'm Dr. Brian Toth, and it's an honor for me to introduce our 2017 Tessier lecturer, Dr. Kenneth Salyer. Ken is one of those privileged first generation of Tessier disciples. And I say privileged because they had the opportunity to learn from the master and take these great ideas and run with it and teach that next generation, of which I am, all of these principles. You'll be hearing more about that extraordinary band of brothers that we will learn about in Ken's lecture. There were four individuals, these four, that I had a particularly wonderful relationship with, and a lot of that will be described, a lot because I was one of Danielle Marshak's early fellows, and I was adopted somewhat as a younger brother by the other three. Ken was a Kansas boy, born in Kansas City, graduate at the University of Kansas, went to Kansas Medical School and mentored by David Robinson because of Ken's early fascination with lip and palate surgery. General surgery residency brought him to Parkland, and it's fascinating today when all of these new Kennedy assassination documents get released. Ken was the intern on the neurosurgical service and one of the first to respond to the emergency ward at Parkland Memorial when John F. Kennedy was brought in with a bullet in his head. Ken then went back to Kansas, where he did his plastic surgical residency. So Ken, that little Kansas boy, Kansas wasn't big enough for Ken, so once it was all said and done, he tasted the big lights of Texas and traded his little red Dorothy shoes in for big red cowboy boots. Ken was the first academic chairman of plastic surgery at the UT Southwestern, which has turned into one of the great training programs in America. In 1971, he was exposed to Paul Tessier at NYU, and then by invitation went to Paris in 1972, where Tessier demonstrated a lot of his newer techniques. He entered private practice in '79 and continued contributing to both the cleft and craniofacial world. He's an internationalist at heart and has been a prolific contributor. He's written these innumerable articles, 11 books, chapters, and has 29 fellows. There are two books that are worthy of mention. When I finished my training, shortly thereafter, the Atlas of Craniomaxillofacial Surgery came out, which impacted me and was used regularly by me as I tried and evolved with new and different procedures. He's unique in that he is both an excellent cleft and craniofacial surgery, and his 2-volume textbook that he did with János Bardák is outstanding. Ken is most proud of having been president of this organization and being one of its founders. He also was the founder of the UT Southwestern program, president of the American Craniofacial Society, president of the ASMS, and chairman of the Plastic Surgical Research Council. He's an extraordinary teacher, surgeon, and contributor. He's very charismatic. He's almost a showman in the sense that he creates a great amount of energy and interest in what he presents. He's been a mentor to many a young surgeon. He's ambitious, as were all four of the fabulous four, as I like to refer them to, but they maintained great friendships and took craniofacial surgery to a very high level. He's proud of his foundation in 1986 of the International Craniofacial Institute, and in 1989, the World Craniofacial Foundation. Ken loves craniofacial surgery, that's undeniable. But as importantly, he really has adored his craniofacial friends, both in the States and throughout the world. Let's talk about Ken a little bit, the man, because we all know his accomplishments. Ken truly loves his family. He's a loyal and trusted colleague, and there's a great country and western song, T for Texas, T for Tennessee. For Ken, it's T for Texas, T for Telluride. Loves to travel and has a creative and engaged mind. There are three organizations that Linton has alluded to that I know Ken put nears the top of his life and things that he looks forward to that most of you or many of you do not know about. That's the American Alpine of Plastic Surgery, the Italian American Plastic Surgical Group, and the Mexican American Group. American Alpine Plastic Surgery has 22 members, and as you can see by these photos, there was a significant craniofacial representative. Here's Fernando Ortiz Monasterio before one of his face plants in powder in his early 80s. You can see Scott Bartlett over here. Here's our current president here. Here's Daniel Marshak over here. Here's Hans Anderl, who was an excellent craniofacial surgeon in Innsbruck, Austria. Wolfgang Muhlbauer, all major contributors. And in this meeting, there's always a bit of jockeying of, the craniofacial surgeons against the microsurgeons, against the aesthetic surgeons. Trust me, the craniofacial surgeons were always the best and the brightest and the most creative. Antonio Fuente del Campo, member of this group, and Bill Little started a collaboration between Mexican and American plastic surgeons. These were wonderful educational experiences where we each presented for 20, 30 minutes, enjoyed each other's company. None of us had an ounce of Italian blood in us, but for 20 years, 10 biannual sessions, we got together, including Linton and Ken, including Fernando down here, where we would go to Italy, have an academic session, but also share experiences with our American and Italian colleagues. Linton loves to fish. Every time I call him, oh, Lucy and I are going fishing. And this was a great weekend that Linton organized at his beloved Bright Creek in Pennsylvania. And again, there's a craniofacial, here's Fernando, Danielle, you've got Hans, Linton, Larry Ketch. I mean, and as you can see, anything that Ken, and anything Linton does, but Ken as well, is done at a high level. These are all first growth Bordeaux's, which quickly went by the small group. Whenever we're out, we always try and get together. This was shortly after the eulogy of Daniel Marshak that night, where your current president, Fernando, the Whitakers, the Salyers, and myself were with Nina Marshak, who sadly is no longer with us, and we continued that by 2 nights ago, getting together for dinner privately and quietly here in Cancun. Ken was a great family man. He came from a family where his dad was a dentist, grew up in Kansas, has 2 wonderful sisters, and here's a family picture of him taken fairly recently along with Lucy, with his 2 children and his 6 grandchildren. Now, behind every great man is an even more extraordinary woman, and that's Lucy, sitting in the front row next to Ken. So if I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulder of giants. This is a letter of Isaac Newton that he wrote to Robert Hooke in 1676. These band of brothers, these fabulous 4, these men impacted my life personally, but also professionally. And I'm honored to consider Ken a great friend and colleague, and I'm honored to be here and introduce him. And Ken, in case you worried, you have lived a life that matters. And I encourage all of you to read Ken's autobiography. Ken, thank you for being here.
Why are some people risk takers and others are not? What are the characteristics of bold risk takers? I was so excited to be invited by Paul Tessier in 1972 for us to come to Paris and see the work he was doing. He invited over 20 other physicians, surgeons, well-known surgeons, many of them like ourselves, just beginning, to Hospital Foch, where he'd been for many years doing his pioneering surgery. In my opinion, Paul Tessier should have had the Nobel Prize. He did that level of work. We are all here today because of him. He first told the world, the plastic surgery world, about his work in 1967 at the International Confederation of Plastic and Reconstructive Surgeons, presenting 5 cases of Lefort 3 advancement that he had modified the techniques, and it was electrifying for the world of plastic surgery. And all of us young bucks were attracted to this and touched a lot. Enough that I didn't know that this was the defining moment for the 6 of us. That because of this moment, I take a term from Shakespeare, which is a band of brothers. And we became a loyal band of brothers, but at the same time competed with one another always. Always. But we were loyal, and we interacted, as Brian has already told you. At that time, we were in 72 in the Hospital Foch, why Tessier was an excellent teacher, an excellent person, and we got to know him. Very intense, very hardworking, and very, very dedicated to his surgery, but at the same time knew how to enjoy life. Would come down, we would dine at the luncheon break, and he'd have some wine, and he'd go back and finish his surgery. He had developed these skulls from actual patients with these deformities and placed bone grafts in there, and that was very helpful for us. We would gather in the evening at the brasserie, and our leader, our mentor, was Fernando Ortiz Monasterio. He was dynamic, and I'd never met him. None of us had met him. He already had a major reputation. He was 13 years older than the rest of us. But he fit right in immediately, and he showed us Paris, Fernando Ortiz Monasterio style, and I'll never forget it. It was really a real experience. We became closer, and the 4 of us shown here with Tessier founded the International Craniofacial Club in 1973. And I held a symposium there, which was quite successful, on craniofacial and plastic surgery in the orbital region, and it was published in the symposium series. Fernando Ortiz was infectious. He was dynamic. He was truly a Renaissance man. He interacted with anyone in the world, everyone in the world, and he was so charming and very intelligent. He and Leonor, his wife, were a very distinguished couple, and they entertained with the creme de la creme of Mexico and all of the world. And he developed a training program after training with Truman Blocker in Galveston. He was also an adventurer, like all of us. And we all loved to travel, and we all had athletic backgrounds. He took his motorbike and took Leonor around Europe. And he also, as an older guy, sailed with the team with Mexico. So he really always led an exciting life. He met Tessier in 1963, not about craniofacial, but about surgery in the orbital region, which they both loved and were involved in. Later, Fernando did his first infant surgery in 1969 in Mexico City, and he went on to develop a premier hospital at Hospital A. Gonzalez. Now, that young fellow you see back there, Fernando, I thank you for the honor of this lecture, and you've done an excellent job as president. Thank you very much. He followed in the footsteps and was mentored by him and took over as chief at the hospital while Fernando was still there, and they were doing a superb job. They trained 800 residents. Fernando was known, yes, as the maestro, and indeed he was. Fernando elevated the quality of plastic surgery in Mexico and all of Latin America. He trained 800 residents, 38 fellows, developed the monoblock, many, many publications, and the most important thing, for all of us in our group and for everyone else, he inspired people to be excellent, to live a full life, and have a multifaceted life. He was expert in many things, in cultural things, in art, in science. He was our mentor. He showed Linton and I a lifestyle we didn't know, and we adopted it. Equally, a giant was Daniel Marshak. Daniel Marshak read in a public article about this man who was doing surgery. And this influenced him to go into plastic surgery. Tessier was the reason he went in. And when he was in the Army, in the service, after getting his medical degree, he purposely got himself assigned to Hospital Foch, and twice a week he would see Tessier working with the residents or house officers that were there who were not very interested in what Tessier was doing. They were burn doctors, and here Tessier was doing this dramatic surgery. Daniel, in the face of this public international figure at that time, repeated what he had seen, and in 1971 did his first intracranial hypertelorism. And so this was quite a thing under the shadow of this giant Tessier, which he had become internationally. And it wasn't until 1976 that he was invited to Hospital Necker, the children's hospital, where he met Dominique René, and you all know the story from there. In 1982, they published a series on over 200 cases of infants' craniofacial surgery, and it became the hallmark at the time. But our group was meeting on a regular basis then, the Band of Brothers, the International Craniofacial Club. And we were talking about infant surgery. And so we took what Tessier showed us and moved on to the next phase of infant surgery. And Daniel talked to us about it. He says, I want to start an association in Europe, like the association in the States. And we said, yes, do it, go for it. And of course, as Brian mentioned, he did found the European Alpine Workshop, and that was our model for the American. And he received every major award and was a prolific publisher. These are just a few of his publications. Daniel was admirable. He was a mentor to all of us. We mentored each other. We challenged each other. We questioned each other. And we would present all of our cases every year, our problem cases, and we learned from one another. You heard about Linton Whitaker yesterday. I'm going to tell you things you don't know about him. Linton grew up in Austin, Texas. He's a Texan. And he graduated from the University of Texas. And when he graduated from high school, he was offered a drafting position from the St. Louis Cardinals. I think he should have taken it. But instead, he went into medicine. And actually, it was the right decision for him. When he interned in Montreal General Hospital, he met this beautiful, gorgeous blonde from Latvia. And Lucy and I went there with him. But anyway, they fell in love, and she's the pillar of strength for the family and for Linton. They got married, and when they were in the service, they traveled Europe in this roadster. What an assignment. They were stationed in Germany. But they had a wonderful, wonderful experience. They came back to Philadelphia. They had 3 children. Linton eventually became chief at Penn and was chief at Children's Hospital for 20 years. At Children's Hospital, he did his first craniofacial surgery the same year that he introduced the program at Penn. He published his 8 cases in 1977, starting infant surgery in 74. And I think the apple of his eye is the founding of the Center for Human Appearance that you heard a lot about yesterday. This was one of his early cases. This was Dan, the young man that he talked about previously. Ian Jackson was likewise an athletic man when he was young. He got many awards in crickets. He's marrying his wife here this is their wedding picture with Marjorie, and their son, a wedding picture below. He was consultant at Craniofacial, and at Craniofacial, he developed craniofacial surgery. He then went to the Mayo Clinic and for 10 years was chief there and ended up in Detroit. He was a major contributor to craniofacial surgery, and particularly in the arena of head and neck cancer. He really added a lot to our group, and we had a wonderful interaction with him for many, many years. Another Ian from the UK came to the Children's Hospital, Sick Kids Hospital in Canada, and trained there. He read about Tessier when he was studying for his boards in '69, and in '71 he got an invitation, and he spent 10 days with Tessier. He went home and immediately talked to his neurosurgeon and says, we're gonna do this on a cadaver, and then we're gonna do a case. And a month later, he did his first intracranial hypertelorism in 1971. And he went on to develop a great program at Sick Kids, and we have a number of great surgeons here from this program, and it's continued to be a great program in craniofacial surgery. And last but not least, I think Brian took my talk away. I don't really have to say too much. I was appointed as chief at University of Texas Southwestern Medical School, was the chief of plastic surgery at Parkland and Children's. And yes, indeed, my early work was with clefts. And I was told, do not touch the nose, it interferes with growth. So in 1970, as a young moved young man, I started doing the nose. And I started doing the lip-nose complex. And I found out that these noses would grow all right if you did delicate surgery. But it wasn't until 16 years later, knowing that growth was okay, that I published my first article in PRNS in 1986. We all started doing infant surgery. I was introduced to craniofacial surgery by Jack Converse when I was a fellow visiting NYU. And he invited me back many times, and I was lucky enough to be invited there in '71 when Paul Tessier was a Kazanjian professor, and he did his first procedure in the United States on a girl with cruisons, and he did a forehead advancement, tongue and groove, and a Lefort 3, and it was about a 13-hour procedure. But there was a young resident there helping. It was Dr. Converse's resident. There was a guy named Joe McCarthy. Joe McCarthy is when I met this man, and he went on, as you know, to pioneer infant surgery and distraction. And we've heard a lot about him at this meeting. I did my first craniofacial case in '71 and my first intracranial hypertelorism on this girl with Robinow syndrome, and my goal was no incisions on the face. That was my goal. And I achieved that. I went to her wedding. She married a guy as tall as I am, and she was under 5 feet tall. I started infant surgery in '73, but again, I was hesitant to publish anything. And we all talked about it. And early on, we thought in the syndromal children, if we did surgery in the upper frontal cranial region, that we might even have improved growth in the maxilla. We found out that doesn't happen in the syndromal. But in the non-syndromal, getting a good result gives a very good result in most cases with remodeling. So this was a significant contribution by our group. We were in a very exciting time in the '70s and into the '80s. Sam Przansky, an orthodontist, is holding a meeting here. You'll recognize many of those. You see Linton and also Ian and myself and other people, Paul Tessier, that you recognize. But everyone in those days, instead of going to the aesthetic meetings when we were having joint meetings, would go to craniofacial. It was very popular. Now, we were still competing. We all 6 were competing. When we were visiting with Linton in Stowe, we went for a hike. It was who could get up the mountain first. Here were the 3 of us. But we were like a bunch or a group of touring professional golf players. We became the best of friends. We dined together. We became very close. But at the same time, we were in there competing with one another, and that's what made it really so good. And this is how we spent our life. Here's 5 of my brothers having a good time in Mexico. I don't know what they're doing. I wasn't there. And so the only time we came together to do to publish an article was about problems and complications. And believe me, in the early days, we had plenty of them. We were all came home, developed centers, and taught ourselves how to do it. And so we presented our 793 cases with the complications and problems. It's the only time the 6 of us published anything together. But 4 of us, as Brian said, came together and did the first atlas of craniomaxillofacial surgery. In all of these years, we were interacting and meeting, not only officially once a year, but many other times unofficially, as Brian has already described. And it was a wonderful time. And then I arrived at 1977. This was my first major crisis in my life. I lost my job. I was involved in a divorce. And I thought this was the end of my passion, the end of my career. How could I do craniofacial surgery in private practice with a team and support the team and make it work? So I rebound from this, and I would like to tell all of you, the young people particularly, you will have some time in your life when you're in a crisis. Use it and go on and use it to become better. And this is my recommendation to you. Do not be discouraged if things are not going the way you want. Rebound. And what I did, and it took me till 1986, we were able to develop a premier center. And I invited a great neurosurgeon. I had never had good neurosurgery. From CHOP, Derek Bruce came, and for the next 30 years, I had this beautiful neurosurgery, and there was no limits to what we did. And we developed many things together. And also, into my life came the love of my life, and the person that's been so important to me. And yes, it did change me to be a better guy, I hope. Certainly, thank you, my soulmate. 30 years. Ian Monroe, I invited one of my brothers. I invited Ian Monroe and Ian Jackson, and there's Derek in the middle. And we continued to compete. We competed with one another, and we attracted patients from 75 countries and every state in the U.S., and we had a wonderful premier center in a private setting, but with the support of the staff, and we had 17 FTEs. And we developed, particularly for pediatric neurosurgery, we developed facial cranial surgery to broaden the approach to the cranial base. One of the procedures that I like and use, not only for the children, but also for aesthetic reasons, was the lamellar split that I published in 1990. And here's a case of a dish face with normal occlusion, and did a lamellar split of the cheeks, cranial bone graft to the nose, and bone graft to the tip of the nose. And here she is 13 years later. So we can use these techniques for children, and our goal, as Linton always says, is to get not just good, but to get better than good, get beautiful good if possible. And that's the goal for my cases. And yes, Janis was my partner for many years. We traveled the world in clefts, and clefts remain a primary interest. And yes, we published our atlas on that. Now, what about the International Society? What's the history of this group? In 1978, the 6 of us were meeting in Mexico City, and we were discussing. Corona has had some meetings and has honored Tessier, but we've now come to the point where we need a society. And this group of 6, the Band of Brothers, made the decision we're going to initiate and do the International Society of Craniofacial Surgeons. Ian Monroe wanted to be Secretary General, fine. He was going to be in Montreal to present and get the charter accepted by the Confederation of Plastic Surgery, and that's how this organization was started. And we added 9 others who were prominent at the time, and that's the 15 total founding members. And yes, this was the first meeting where Danielle was actually president in '95, and you see 5 of us there, and you've already seen that photograph. This was the core 4, and the other 2 Ians peeled off from the core 4, and we became the very closest and best of friends. This is when Linton was president of this society in 1997 in Santa Fe. And yes, my fellow, Yu Ray Chin, in 1979, 20 years later, became president of this society before I was president, and I was very proud of this young man from Taipei. And here's the 5 of us. The last time that Ian was to be seen with our group, Ian sailed off into the sunset. This is when I was president in Monterey. Here's the 4 of us. And Danielle invited me to the European Alpine in 1988, and I didn't know how to ski. I got a ski instructor and took the ski instructor with me and was skiing. And everybody was making fun of me. Look at this crazy guy. He's got his ski instructor with him. So anyway, I was so elated about doing this that we started, along with others, Lucy and I hosted the first American Alpine in 1990 in Snowmass. And you'll recognize some of these founding members. You see Linton and Renata and Lucy and myself, and you'll recognize some of the other faces in that group. Now, Linton fashions himself as a fisherman, and I would admit he is a good fisherman. He's a good fly fisherman, and he knows a little bit about Burgundy, and he held this group that you've already been told about. But sometimes he gets carried away with this designer stuff, and he wears this. He even fashions with his fly in his earlobe. I think that's a little bit too much, Linton. Anyway, he is a good fisherman, and we had a wonderful time there. And you've already heard about this, and so there we are in our aprons. And here are my good friends enjoying old vintage wine. And here's Ian with his crew. Who's Ian's crew? Valerie, his wife. And he sails around the world. He said he was going to always do that, and indeed he did. So here's the 5 of us. Ian Jackson came back in Mexico City, June 2012, and it wasn't long before we lost our 2 wonderful friends. Here we are casually on Fernando's steps of his beautiful library that he let his residents and let people come and use, and it was a fantastic, fantastic place. So here's to the Renaissance man and the man that was our mentor for style and science and life. And their family of 8 children with Leonor and Fernando's infectious smile. I'll never forget it. I miss this man. Danielle equally with his classic smile with his teeth closed. That's Danielle. I'll never forget this wonderful man. And Linton and Renata. So what about the brothers? What are their contributions? Infant surgery popularized and expanded craniofacial surgery. International Society, each received major awards. Prolific group, together over 1,000 articles, and 250 fellows, of which many of you are there, and I wish I could recognize all of you, and it's your job to carry on the banner for this society and for craniofacial. And what about these risk takers? Refuse to accept the status quo, are in touch with a much greater purpose. They believe anything's possible. They collaborate with talented people, and they're able to effectively execute innovative ideas, whether they do it or whether they appoint a small team to do it. And this is the reward. Then they can scale their innovation to a level that can affect many. So, farewell to Danielle, Fernando, and Leonor. I toast to all of you. And then final, I would like to say the foundation that I've been involved in for 28 years is dedicated to helping the children of the world. Half of the children of the world do not have any treatment. I charge you with the job of helping take care of these children and developing dedicated teams, like the little boy from Uganda who we treated. What does progress mean if it's only available for a minority of the world's population? And my family, and my 80th birthday, my children, my 2 children, and my 6 grandchildren, and the love of my life. Thank you very much.